On a warm Friday evening, Ethan Carter pulled into the back lot of Hawthorne Grille, the upscale restaurant he had poured years of his life into building. Disguised in jeans, a faded Dodgers cap, and a weathered leather jacket, he didn't look anything like the successful entrepreneur behind the Carter Hospitality Group that was intentional. Every few months, Ethan conducted unannounced check-ins at his various establishments, not as the boss, but as an anonymous diner. For him, it wasn't about numbers or glowing Yelp reviews. It was about the pulse of the people, the ones who actually made the place run. If something was broken, he wanted to feel it himself, not read about it in a spreadsheet. As he stepped inside, the hum of clinking silverware and soft jazz surrounded him. The smell of garlic butter and seared steak filled the air, and on the surface everything appeared to be running smoothly. Waiters glided between tables with rehearsed ease, the lighting was warm and welcoming, and customers looked satisfied. But Ethan had spent years in this business. He knew how appearances could lie. His eyes scanned the floor, quickly locking on Brad Whitmore, the general manager. Dressed sharply in a navy button-down and polished shoes, Brad was standing off to the side with his arms crossed, eyes darting across the room like a security camera. His posture wasn't just alert, it was dominating, almost predatory. Ethan's instincts flared. Something about Brad's presence felt off. Ethan moved past the host stand and made his way toward the bar, careful to keep a low profile. He took a seat at the far end and scanned the restaurant again, blending in as just another Friday night customer. But then, just faintly, he heard it. A muffled sound, soft and broken, barely rising above the din of conversation and clatter. It was coming from the hallway near the kitchen. At first he thought he imagined it, but as he turned his head slightly, the sound became clearer. Crying, not loud or dramatic, the kind that someone tries desperately to hold in, the kind born of exhaustion, hopelessness and fear. Curiosity turned to concern. Ethan stood slowly and drifted casually toward the hallway as if headed for the restroom. He passed by the breakroom and caught a glimpse through the slightly ajar door. A young woman, likely in her early 20s, was hunched over, gripping the metal edge of a prep counter like it was the only thing holding her up. Her name tag read, Rachel. Her eyes were red, her shoulders trembling. Standing beside her was another employee, a young man whispering urgently, trying to comfort her without drawing attention. Ethan's heart sank. He didn't know Rachel, but that expression, raw, cornered, overwhelmed, was unmistakable. This wasn't just a bad day. Something was deeply wrong. Ethan didn't barge in. Not yet. He stepped back into the bar area, ordered a water and sat still, listening, thinking. He watched the floor with sharpened eyes now. The server's movements seemed efficient but robotic. Conversations between staff were short and hushed. Brad Whitmore stood near the entrance to the dining room, arms still folded, lips pursed in permanent judgment. The man barely moved, but his presence dominated the room. Ethan had managed people long enough to know the difference between leadership and fear, and what he saw now was unmistakably the latter. That wasn't just management. That was control. He sipped his water and tried to appear detached, but his mind was already racing. If Rachel was crying in the break room and staff were too afraid to say anything out loud, then something toxic was simmering beneath the surface. A toxic culture doesn't just happen overnight. It takes time, power, and silence. And as the minutes ticked by, Ethan became certain whatever was hurting Rachel, it wasn't just about a bad customer or a tough shift. It was something internal, something systemic. And he wasn't going to leave that restaurant until he uncovered the truth and held whoever was responsible accountable. Ethan Carter remained seated at the edge of the bar, the chilled glass of water between his hands forgotten as he listened intently to the ambient noise of the restaurant. His eyes occasionally flicked toward the hallway, where moments earlier he had seen Rachel breaking down in the break room. He couldn't shake the image, her fingers digging into the counter, her shoulders trembling under an invisible weight. As a restaurateur, Ethan had seen burnout, stress, and exhaustion, but this was different. This wasn't just physical fatigue, it was emotional entrapment. And now he needed to understand the full story before making a move that would change everything. Just as he was contemplating how to approach it, the young man who had been beside Rachel stepped out into the dining area. His name tag read, Jake. He moved quickly, hands trembling slightly, as he adjusted the notepad in his apron. His jaw was clenched tight, and his eyes darted nervously toward the front of the restaurant where Brad Whitmore still stood. Watching the room with the cold precision of a gatekeeper, Ethan seized the opportunity. Rising slowly, he walked over to the back of the restaurant, keeping his tone casual as he asked, "Hey man, got a pen?" Jake flinched slightly but handed one over. Ethan didn't walk away. Instead, he glanced at Jake's name tag and said softly, "Jake, I couldn't help but notice your friend seems pretty upset." Jake froze. His fingers tightened around the plates in front of him. "She's fine," he said too quickly. The words brittle and practiced. Ethan tilted his head, lowering his voice. "She doesn't look fine." There was a long pause. Jake looked over at Brad again, who remained in his usual place, arms crossed, ever watchful, then looked back down at the counter. His shoulders sagged just slightly. "She's not fine," he whispered. Barely audible. Ethan nodded gently, allowing silence to do its work. After a moment, he asked, "Is this about a customer?" Jake hesitated. The pause said everything. "No," he muttered. "It's not." Following Jake's line of sight, Ethan's eyes landed once again on Brad. The pieces began fitting together. Rachel wasn't afraid of the crowd of rude guests or the grind of service work. She was afraid of someone with power, someone inside, and Brad Whitmore, with his mechanical smile and suffocating presence, fit the description too well. Still, Ethan needed confirmation. "How long has Rachel been working here?" he asked. Jake responded automatically, a little over a year. Then he winced, realizing he might have said too much. Ethan kept his tone light. "Just wondering if she likes it here." Jake gave a bitter laugh. "She can't afford to leave," he said. "She's stuck." Just then the air shifted. Ethan could feel it. Without turning, Brad was approaching well enough. A smooth but firm voice broke the tension. "Everything okay over here?" Jake's demeanor changed instantly. He busied himself with silverware eyes locked downward. "Yes, sir. Just helping a customer," he mumbled. Ethan turned to face Brad, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just getting a pen. Jake here was kind enough to help me out." Brad's eyes narrowed slightly, but his mouth curved into a practiced smile. "Good," he said, clapping Jake on the shoulder a bit too hard. "Let's stay focused on work." As he walked away, Ethan watched Jake deflate with visible relief. Not willing to let this go, Ethan stepped outside, pretending to check his phone, though his mind was spinning. If Brad was intimidating Rachel and the staff was too scared to speak up, then this wasn't a personnel issue, it was a cultural one. A few moments later, he spotted Dylan, the bartender, who had served him earlier, stepping outside for a break. Dylan leaned against the brick wall, scrolling his phone. Ethan joined him casually. "Long night?" he asked Dylan. Looked up, shrugged. "Fridays are like that." Ethan nodded. "Mind if I ask something? What's your manager?" "Brad." Like Dylan's expression darkened. He glanced around, lowered his voice and said, "He's not just strict. He makes Rachel stay late. Always talks to her, like she owes him something." Dylan paused, then added, "It's not right. We all see it." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Ethan's fists clenched in his pockets. Brad Whitmore wasn't just mismanaging his staff, he was manipulating them, isolating Rachel, preying on her vulnerability, and using his authority like a weapon. This was more than a bad boss. It was a toxic power dynamic, and it had poisoned the culture Ethan had worked so hard to build. He stared at the glowing sign above the restaurant's entrance, the proud name Hawthorne Grille, and knew he couldn't walk away. Not tonight. Not while Rachel and perhaps others were still inside, enduring something they should never have had to face alone. The dinner rush inside Hawthorne Grille had begun to die down, and the warm buzz of conversation softened into a low murmur. Ethan Carter stood just outside the restaurant doors, staring through the glass as his thoughts raced. He had all the confirmation he needed. Rachel wasn't simply overwhelmed, she was being targeted. Brad Whitmore, the man he had entrusted to run this flagship location, had cultivated a culture of silence and fear. And now the question wasn't if Ethan should act. It was how and when. He exhaled deeply, then stepped back inside his stride, slow and steady, as he walked toward the heart of the restaurant. The atmosphere inside remained unaware, but everything was about to change. Rachel was at a table near the center of the room, taking an order from a middle-aged woman with a demanding tone. Her face was a mask of professionalism, but her eyes were hollow, mechanical, as if she were moving on autopilot. Ethan approached her gently, waiting until she had stepped away from the guest before speaking. "Excuse me," he said, his voice just above a whisper. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Rachel blinked, startled. "I'm helping a customer, sir," she replied, unsure. The guest frowned, clearly irritated. "She's with me," the woman snapped. But Ethan kept his gaze on Rachel. "It's important." His tone held quiet urgency, and something in his voice made Rachel hesitate. She nodded, excusing herself, and leading Ethan a few feet away, nervously fidgeting with her apron strings. "I'm not here as a customer," Ethan said gently. "I'm here because I know what's been happening to you. You're not alone, Rachel." Her body stiffened. For a moment, she looked like she might collapse under the weight of it all. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, eyes darting around, voice shaky, but Ethan continued, steady and calm. "Brad, the late shifts, the pressure, the way he treats you like you have no choice." Rachel looked away, her lips quivering. I just can't afford to lose this job," she whispered. "And he knows it." Ethan nodded. "That's exactly why he chose you, but I promise you, he's not untouchable." Before she could respond, a sharp voice cut through the air like a blade. "Is there a problem here?" Brad Whitmore had appeared beside them, his expression neutral, but his eyes hard. Rachel instinctively shrank back, her hands clenching at her sides. Ethan didn't flinch. He turned to face Brad fully. "Actually," he said, his voice level, "I think now is the perfect time for a conversation." Brad raised an eyebrow, clearly annoyed but trying to maintain composure. About what exactly? Ethan reached into his pocket, pulled out a slim leather wallet and flipped it open. Inside was his executive ID for Hawthorne Grille Group, complete with corporate credentials. "My name is Ethan Carter," he said, his voice calm but commanding, "and you and I need to talk." The reaction was instant. Rachel gasped, her eyes wide. Nearby servers froze mid-step. The restaurant seemed to pause, suspended in stunned silence. Brad's face went pale. "Sir, he began, but Ethan cut him off. "Save it. I know everything." He pulled out his phone and tapped on an audio file. Rachel's voice played through the speaker, trembling and exhausted. "If I don't do what he says, I'm gone." Then Jake's voice followed. "You can't let him. He doesn't own you." As the recording ended, Brad's jaw tightened, his confidence cracking like glass. "You've been playing power games with people who rely on you to make a living," Ethan said coldly. "You've preyed on vulnerability. But tonight, that ends." Brad's mouth opened, desperate for damage control. "Sir, I can explain." No, Ethan snapped his tone, cutting through the noise like a blade. "You're done. You will never work in this industry again." With that, he pulled out his phone and made a direct call to corporate HR. The words were simple but final. Immediate termination. Documentation follows tonight. Brad stood frozen, humiliated, and powerless. The man who had ruled the restaurant floor with intimidation now looked like a statue, pale, voiceless, and undone by the very silence he'd once demanded from others. Ethan didn't offer comfort. He didn't offer leniency. Brad had made choices, and now he would live with their consequences. As Ethan turned back toward the restaurant floor, Rachel stood still, her eyes fixed on him in disbelief. Slowly, her shoulders began to relax, the tension of months, perhaps years, starting to unwind. Around them, the staff stood silently watching the moment unfold like something from a dream. Ethan met Rachel's gaze and offered a quiet, steady reassurance. "You're safe now," he said. And for the first time that night, she seemed to believe him. She took a slow breath and stood a little straighter. The nightmare was over, but for Ethan, the mission was just beginning. Justice had been delivered, but healing and change would require much more. The tension inside Hawthorne Grille hadn't fully settled when Ethan Carter stepped back onto the dining floor. The restaurant was quieter now. Most of the guests had left, leaving only a few lingering diners and a staff that stood frozen in the aftermath of Brad Whitmore's dramatic removal. Rachel remained near the counter, her hands still trembling, while Jake and Dylan stood nearby with wide eyes and uncertain expressions. Other team members began to gather around, unsure if they should return to their duties or stay and witness what came next. Ethan knew that what he said now wouldn't just define this moment, it would define the future of the entire restaurant. He took a step forward and cleared his throat, his voice calm but clear. "I know tonight wasn't what any of you expected." He began glancing around the room and making eye contact with each staff member he could, but what happened here had to happen. For too long, this place, your workplace, has been managed by fear. That ends tonight. Brad is gone, and I want every one of you to hear this. We're not going to replace one dictator with another. We're going to replace him with leadership, real leadership. He paused to let his words sink in. You deserve to come to work without fear. You deserve respect. And from this point on, that's not just the goal, it's the standard. A quiet murmur rippled through the group, and then Jake stepped forward, visibly nervous, but determined. "Mr. Carter, with all due respect, this isn't just about Brad," he said. "He was part of it. Yeah, but it's more than that. We've all been afraid to speak up, not just because of him, but because of how things work around here. You speak out, you're seen as a problem. You fall behind once, and you're disposable." Dylan nodded, stepping in beside him. "It's like we're constantly walking on eggshells, and when someone's being mistreated, we all see it, but we stay quiet because we're scared we'll be next." The words hung heavy in the air, raw and honest. Ethan felt a pang in his chest. This wasn't just a failure of management. It was a failure of culture, and it had his name on it. Ethan nodded slowly. "I hear you," he said. "And you're right. This restaurant didn't end up like this overnight. It happened one silent moment at a time, one ignored red flag, one fearful glance that's on me. But I'm not here to defend the past. I'm here to change the future." He took a slow breath and continued. "Starting tonight, Hawthorne Grille will be placed under direct corporate oversight. We're implementing an anonymous reporting system for staff concerns, and we're reviewing all past grievances. Anyone who ever felt unheard, you'll be heard now. I'm not just asking for your trust, I'm working to earn it." Rachel looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for signs of pretense, but what she found was sincerity. She wasn't the only one watching closely. Ethan could feel the cautious hope beginning to form around the room, like morning light trying to push through thick clouds. "We're creating a space where it's safe to speak up," he said, "where your well-being matters as much as your performance. That means no more retaliation, no more favoritism, and no more fear." Dylan folded his arms and nodded slightly. Jake glanced at Rachel, who offered him the faintest, fragile smile. For the first time, something was beginning to shift, not just in policy, but in spirit. Ethan concluded with a simple but powerful invitation. "If you've got suggestions, ideas, or even frustrations, I want to hear them. My door isn't just open, it's waiting. Because culture isn't built by rules, it's built by people, and each of you is part of that foundation." He turned his gaze to Rachel. "You showed incredible courage, and it's because of that courage we can build something better together." The room was still not from fear this time, but from reflection. The storm had passed, but in its place came a resolve, one that promised a future where dignity, honesty, and mutual respect weren't optional. They were non-negotiable. The first bricks of a new foundation had just been laid. As the final chairs were stacked and the lights at Hawthorne Grille dimmed for the night, Ethan Carter remained seated in his car across the street, watching through the windshield as his team slowly filed out of the building. They walked in small clusters. Jake Dillon, Rachel talking quietly among themselves. There was no loud celebration, no dramatic cheers, but Ethan didn't need those things to know a change had occurred. Their shoulders no longer sagged with the weight of dread, and their expressions, though still cautious, were lighter, more open. For the first time in what may have been months or longer, his staff looked like people who believed tomorrow might actually be different. And that was everything. Ethan leaned back in his seat, his hands resting on the steering wheel, lost in thought. Tonight had started with a gut feeling. Something off about the place that no spreadsheet could ever capture. But what it had become was far more revealing than he expected. It wasn't just about Rachel. It wasn't just about Brad Whitmore. It was about a system that had allowed fear to thrive unchecked. And the sobering realization was this: if this had happened under his roof at his flagship restaurant, then how many other places in his company might be hiding the same rot? How many Rachels were out there crying behind breakroom doors, too afraid to speak, too convinced that silence was their only form of survival? The truth hit Ethan hard. Success doesn't excuse neglect. Being a leader doesn't mean standing at the top of an empire. It means standing in front of your people when they need protection. He had built Hawthorne Grille to be a place of warmth, of excellence, of shared pride. But somewhere along the line, systems and numbers had taken precedence over people. He couldn't undo what had already happened, but he could be responsible for what came next. And that he knew was where true leadership began, not in ambition, but in accountability. Not in control, but in care. Not in being feared, but in being trusted. He thought about Rachel's trembling voice, about Jake's quiet bravery, about Dylan stepping up even when it wasn't easy. Those weren't just employees. They were reminders of what mattered most: dignity, empathy, and the right to feel safe at work. He also thought about the silence that had allowed Brad's behavior to go unchecked. Ethan understood now that silence can be as dangerous as action. Looking away, choosing not to ask, deciding it's not your place, these are the seeds from which injustice grows. And if you have the power to speak up, the power to intervene, then doing nothing becomes its own form of complicity. As the last team member disappeared down the block, Ethan reached for his phone and opened his notes app. The first line he typed was simple: company-wide audit begins Monday. No more blind spots. But beyond audits and systems, he knew the deeper change had to start in the hearts of the leaders themselves. Every manager under his brand would now be evaluated, not just for results, but for how they treated their people. Ethan was going to make sure no one else had to endure what Rachel had. That was his promise. And this time he wouldn't need a disguise to check in. He'd be present, visible, and fiercely committed to doing what's right. So if you're out there working in silence, watching someone suffer, or suffering yourself, remember this: your voice matters. Speaking up might feel impossible, but it can be the first ripple that cracks the surface of something unjust. And if you're in a position of power, remember that your silence is never neutral. It either upholds the pain or helps dismantle it. Ethan Carter learned that tonight. And now, through his story, maybe others will too. Because real change doesn't come from grand speeches. It comes from quiet courage, firm resolve, and the refusal to look away when it matters most. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect on the power of standing up for what's right, then join us on Deep Inside HQ, where we bring you real, raw, and powerful stories that challenge injustice and ignite change. Every voice matters. Every story counts. Subscribe now to be part of a community that believes in courage, truth, and humanity behind every headline. Your support helps us uncover more stories that deserve to be heard, because together we don't just witness transformation, we create it.